there's a lot of aspects that make Asia different than what we're used to in sort of the European American context. Probably one of the most striking ones, and of course, if you have to ever learn languages in this region, is the fact that the writing systems are entirely different. The writing systems in Asia are, in their traditional form, so they've changed a little bit recently, are what we call ideographic. I can't remember what this is. You know, it's a game you can play where basically you have a picture and a word. You have to figure out what the word is from the picture. Like you draw a fish, and that means the word fish. That's your Asian writing systems. Your Asian writing systems are basically picture-based. So what this means is what you draw, what you write is actually an image, or if you would, a picture. And from that, the person can basically figure out what the word is. Let me give you an example of this. Okay, this is from years ago. This is Beijing. This is on the route that's the sort of the Imperial Walk from what's usually called the Forbidden City Market, the Purple City, through the various temples to the north, I think it is. This is middle of winter, so this is literally, you know, middle of December. And what you see here is a guy he's got a little bag, very typical in China, bag of hot water. And what he's doing is he's writing characters. So here you see Chinese characters. Now, of course, these are basically frozen water. The minute you write the water down there, it freezes. And so the great thing is, of course, is when it warms up later in the day, this will all disappear. So it's like, you know, it's like the world's most temporary graffiti, you might say. There's several things that are really key about this. What he's doing is, at least I was asking one of the other folks watching, and what he was doing is he's writing parts of poems. So what he's doing is he's writing like the first stanza or the first line in a poem, really famous poem. One of the people I was with said that this particular one, he's doing these in different script, by the way. This is done in a more standard script. This is being done in what's called a scholar's script or a calligraphy script. There's about 30 different ways of writing. Now, the characters are actually the same, but the way you do them, just like in Western calligraphy, varies. And this was a very old poem. This is a Tang Dynasty poem from about 700 AD. So he's doing it in script from that period, like the guy would have done it originally. And what he does, they've done the first line, and then he stops. And then the guys around, I expect like this guy in the yellow jacket here, are actually going to try to guess what the poem is. And they'll actually, if they know, they'll recite it, and he'll tell them if they're right or wrong. So what you get is this really sort of fascinating example of pre-internet, you know, pre-social media, social interaction among strangers. And the key part of this is it wouldn't matter what part of China you're from. In fact, it wouldn't matter whether you were speaking Cantonese, which is an entirely different dialect from Putonghua or Mandarin Chinese, which is probably what these guys speak. But for example, this guy here, this guy here could be from the far west, speaking one of the Western dialects. He can still read the characters because each of these characters is a picture. Now, what that means is because they're pictures, you can have different languages. You can read the same pictures. My wife, for example, can go to Japan and she can read hiragana script. Even though it's written by Japanese, the pictures, many of the pictures still have exactly the same meaning as they do in China. So the picture remains the same. You just plug your word from your language into the picture. So, you know, if it was the picture of a fish, and you'd call it fish in English, and French it would be pêche. So you don't have to share a common spoken language because the written system isn't reflecting the spoken language. You know, the Arabic script that we use in the Western languages is phonetic. So you have to a certain extent, if you look at something written in French, you have to understand French to be able to read it. If it was done in Chinese, you only have to understand what the characters mean in your language to be able to read it. So it's a very efficient system for people that are of different linguistic backgrounds. Because now the downside, of course, is unlike the way you probably learned language, is you have to memorize each character. So for example, if you're in, I think it's third grade in China, kids will remember, I think it's like 3,000 or 4,000 characters. Because this particular character, say this one here, you have to memorize what it means because there's no clue. You can't sound it out like you would with, say, a phonetic system like, say, English or French or Spanish. So you have to remember, by the time you're in university, I believe one of the guys at Northwestern was telling me, I think it's 10 or 11,000 characters you have to be able to recognize. So one of the things you find in China, people are reading newspapers, even if they're reading newspapers online, is that they'll actually have their phone set up with an app where you can scan the character, it'll actually give them a translation, either read it for them or convert it to some other form. So characters get incredibly complicated in China, and you have to memorize them. So you don't sound out characters. It doesn't work that way. These are basically images that reflect words or concepts. So the great thing about this is you can come from an entirely different region where you speak an entirely different language, but as long as you memorize if the characters still have the same meaning, you can actually read it in your language. Now, this is a huge source of unity, for example, in this region. And it's one reason why you find Chinese characters still as, one of the two main writing systems in Japan. It's simply because of that unity. It allows someone who's Japanese to walk through a Chinese street, or I would maybe even walk down and look at this guy, what this guy's doing, and have some idea, if they know the poetry, have some idea of what's actually written here, even though they don't speak a word of Putonghua, Mandarin Chinese. So it allows people of different linguistic backgrounds to share thoughts in terms of their writing. Now, the downside is, of course, from an educational standpoint, everything's done by memory. So, and this is one aspect of the Asian education system. It's very, very memory intensive. And in part, that's because from the time kids enter school, they learn to trace out characters on piece of papers, learn how to write the characters, and also memorize the meaning of the characters. One of the side effects I just sort of note in passing is this guy has really nice calligraphy, especially this one here. And what this means, among other things, is calligraphy in China, or actually calligraphy in Asia, is a real important sign of sophistication. Being able to write in an artistic fashion as a sign of sophistication, of style, of being intellectual and stuff like that, that is entirely missing from the West. In the West, even if you still write by hand, there's not any of that. One of the side effects is you'll find, for example, a lot of the apps in China, you can actually write the character on your phone, and it'll copy your finger tracing. And some of my friends have gotten really good at writing really nicely done characters with their finger, just like they would have been using a brush, 20, 50, or a pen 20, 50 years ago. So the actual form of writing, the style you do the characters in, is still a real important part of status and educational social prestige in Asia. And this guy, not too subtly, is sort of making a statement that he's somebody. Literally, by the way he's writing these characters, he's telling the folks, I'm sophisticated, I've got style. And to a certain extent, if they're looking at this stuff, they're thinking, yeah, you do. Some of these characters, like these guys here, are absolutely beautiful. And I've got some stuff in the office that shows stuff like that. So it's this is part and parcel of this whole idea of ideographic writing, which is both a unifying factor. And of course, then if you're not in it, or if you want to separate from it, it's different. So in Korea, about, I think, 500 years ago, the current emperor then of Korea decided he didn't want to deal with the Chinese, so he invented their own writing system, which is what you see in Korea now. Because they didn't want to deal with the Chinese or be part of the Chinese. So, this has all sorts of consequences attached to it. Probably the other big thing to really remember in this area is that, and they're sort of related, ethnicity in Asia, especially in China, has till 5 years ago been very, very different than we tend to see in the West. Ethnicity in China very specifically was tied to the majority population, which are called Han, which is actually the name group for that particular ethnic group. So the majority of folks who are Chinese are called Han. In the South, you have the folks in Guangdong province, like my family, who are Cantonese. The folks in Hong Kong, for example, are largely Cantonese. They have a different dialect. Most importantly, they have a different value system. They're in different culture in large part. So what you find is when the Han take over China, think of that first Emperor Mao, when they take over China, they basically say, okay, you guys are gonna have to use this writing system. So everyone has to use that. We don't care if you learn how to speak Han Chinese, but you have to be able to write it in the sense of write characters we can understand. If you want to be part of the government, if you want to get ahead, if you want to be somebody, then you're going to have to learn the Han way of doing stuff. So rather than saying it's either this or nothing, they allow you the choice. But the interesting thing is the choice means you're going to be pretty much second-class citizen. And that's what that meant is in China, you find till maybe 5 or 10 years ago, ethnic diversity was still very, very strong. And large parts of the population spoke languages other than Putonghua or Mandarin Chinese, even though they'd been part of China for thousands of years. Certainly not what you see in the West, or certainly not in the United States. So ethnicity was something that you kept, but it didn't abrogate your ability to be part of something else. You could just learn to be part of another group and still keep your ethnicity. So you could be multi-ethnic in a way that we're sort of familiar with here in Hawaii. That's really not part of how things function almost anywhere else. So you didn't use ethnicity as a separation point, unlike the Germans and the Russians we saw earlier in the semester. The other part is that in this part of the world is a very strong sense of sociobiology and the idea that you inherit your behavior. Now, if you're from Asia, then the way you'll find this out is if you go back to your birth certificate, you'll generally find that not only tell the day you were born, it'll usually tell the hour, and if it's in China and Korea, it'll tell you down to the minute when you were born. There'll actually be one of the midwives who'll sit there with a stopwatch. When you pop out of your mom, they pop the stopwatch, and they actually record that in your birth certificate. And the reason for that is in Asia, there's a very strong sense not only of people inherit their skills and abilities from their families, but also they inherit part of their skills and abilities from the time and moment of birth. In other words, you go through time. I suppose in the West it's sort of similar to astrology. It's not quite the same thing. That part's called Ming Shui. But basically the idea that to impart your potentials are defined by your time of birth. But other parts of your potentials, even more so, are defined by your relatives. In other words, you inherit all this. Now, it doesn't matter that there's no evidence to support this. In Asia, everyone believes it. And again, you have to remember that evidence is not near as important to most people as belief. In Japan, this is taken a step further in a rather strange way. In Japan, they've added to the sociobiology. So you not only inherit from family, you not only inherit from time of birth. In Japan, you also inherit from location. So actually in the Japanese legal system, if you're from Japan, not if you're born in Japan, but you leave Japan for generally about more than 18 months, when you come back, you're not considered completely Japanese anymore. Your behavior will have been modified as far as they're concerned because you're not physically in the Japanese islands. Likewise, if your family has, genealogy of being from Japan, but you were raised and born in Hawaii or in Brazil or someplace like that, the Japanese do not actually legally consider you to be Japanese because you weren't born in Japan and you don't live in Japan. Now, this isn't true in China and Korea, but in Japan, this sociobiology, so your actually geographic placement in Japan is actually a legal part of being Japanese. And it defines your citizenship to a certain extent. It certainly defines your educational opportunities, and even more so defines your business opportunities. There's no way that you could become successful in a major Japanese corporation, even if you're born and raised in Japan, if you've left Japan for 2 years and haven't gone back to visit. Because that 24 months outside of Japan, Japanese are going to see that somehow has modified your behavior, modified your brain, modified you physiologically. So you're no longer completely Japanese, and so you're no longer completely trustworthy. So in Japan, and as far as I know, unique, maybe it isn't, but it's the only one I know of, you actually have the need to actually physically be in Japan, or if you've left Japan, you have to go back pretty much every year, only for a week or so. But that sort of re-energizes you in being Japanese, and then you can go spend another year off. So it's a very complex idea of the sort of extension of this idea of sociobiology, with the idea that your behavior can be shaped not only by your genealogy and by your time, but also by location.